Greetings, good morning. I'm glad to see you all here, and I'm glad to be here, and I hope you find this presentation useful and meaningful to you. I just have a couple of preliminary comments. Everyone can hear me, right? Yes, okay. I'm going to talk for about 30-ish minutes on dividing up equity among the founders of a company, and there'll be a couple of other related topics. We'll have 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end of the presentation, and if there's no questions, I've got a couple of bonus topics that I can cover if people select them. Also, I like to have interactive presentations, so if you have a question about the topic that I'm covering, just raise your hand and let's deal with let's cover the question then. I think that works better. Also, keeping with the interactive theme, I will ask as we go along if I've made a point clear, if I need to cover something a little bit more, and I'll want you to use your voting buttons, but you don't have fancy voting buttons. We just have to use the old-fashioned voting button, which is your next. So you just need to do, this is for yes, and this is no. And I think, and if anyone has neck problems, you can use the thumb. Okay, we got that covered. All right, so let's start. The first thing that I think is important, I should say, I work with startups and business owners all the time, and hopefully, I see a lot of mistakes that they made, so hopefully this presentation will help you avoid some common mistakes. One of the mistakes I see is misidentifying who the founders of a company are. So who are the founders? The founders are the group of guys or gals sitting around the proverbial kitchen table who decide to start a business or start an entity or explore starting a company. A founder is not the person that small group hires 9 months later to take on an aspect of the business or to build the business. That person would be an early employee or an early executive. A founder is also not the person who 9 months later offers to invest money in the company for a passive role. That person's an investor. So typically founders are one to four people. I have seen one entity that actually had 6 founders, but that was a professional service business, so that's going to be atypical. So anyway, be clear on who your founders are. And I understand the world is not black and white. There may be someone who comes on board a little later than the first group. Just make a decision whether that person should be part of the founders. So then you're faced with how do you divide up the equity pie among all of the founders. The good news is that there is no one single method that you need to use to divide this up properly. The bad news is that there's no single method that if you use that will guarantee the right division of equity. So what a lot of founders do, which is usually the wrong way, is just to divide the equity among the founders equally. So if there's 4 founders, each gets 25%. That might be the right answer, but it's usually not. So I'm going to present a variation of a method that is called the Founders Pie Calculator, and it involves 4 simple steps after you decide who the founders are. Number 1, deciding the different categories of contributions that all the founders will make to the company. And we'll go through these. There's like the pre-existing IP, who's going to be taking on the business role of the company. Then the founders assign a weight, or in other words, a value to each type of contribution. And then the founders collectively decide what each founder contributes to each category of contribution. And then lastly, it's just a mathematical process of determining what the percentage ownership would be. So the Founders Pie Calculator was actually created by a professor of entrepreneurship at Carnegie Mellon named Frank Dimler. And I think he formulated this as a compilation of a lot of theories that were going along around in the marketplace. And I present a variation of that Founders Pie Calculator. You may or may not want to Google Frank Dimler and look up his original article that has the original Founders Pie Calculator. I think it's pretty interesting, but I've modified it a little bit. So here are, let's see if we got this. There we go. All right, so I call these the categories of contributions that founders can make to the development of a company. And I've described 7 here. For your company, you might only use 4 of these. You don't have to use all of these. These are just suggestions. Also, for your company, there may be another category of contribution that founders are going to make to the development of the business that's not on here, that maybe relates to the unique industry or the unique product or service that the company will be providing. So let's go through these quickly. The first one, of course, is the idea or the pre-existing IP. I will say people always think, oh, the idea is everything. And actually, the idea is rarely that important to a company. That's because an idea is not, in and of itself, is not protectable. It is not protectable until it's been reduced to some concrete or tangible form, like a computer code, like a business process, like a system, like something like that. And you could have an idea of providing a great specialized service to a particular segment of the community, but that idea is not all that, may not be all that unique. So I usually focus on pre-existing IP, and pre-existing IP means someone who's done 60% of the code for a new software service that's going to be offered on a SaaS model. Okay, right? Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. The second category of contributions that founders can make is business knowledge. So, or organizational expertise. And this would be the founder who has worked with a startup before, knows how to prepare a business plan, knows how to marshal the resources that a startup might need. I kind of think of this as the project management contribution. Next is the time commitment and risk. This quality or this category is who's giving up their full-time job to work on this company full-time. Often founders, maybe 2 of them might quit their full-time job and be working on the company full-time. The other 2 they're keeping their full-time job and they're just going to be working nights and weekends. So that's an important quality to consider when you're dividing up the equity of a company. Domain experience. This is if a founder has particular experience in the industry that the company is going to be operating. And this may, of course, be the same or be the same person who's come up with a pre-existing IP. It may not. It may not. So a good example of this is if you've come up with a new drug and one of the founders has worked, hasn't actually come up with the IP. One of the founders, though, has worked with a pharmaceutical company and knows exactly how clinical trials are put together and completed and knows how to work with the FDA. That's a good example of domain experience. Connections. So connections can be connections in a couple of different ways. Connections could be maybe one founder knows a lot of angel investors, knows a lot of people who'd be willing to actually put down serious money as a passive investor. maybe connections with manufacturing facilities in China or overseas that might be available to manufacture your company's new wearable tech products. Responsibilities. This kind of is similar to time commitment and risk, but for your company it might be different. So this, I mean, who is the person who's going to be answering the call at 2 in the morning that the service has gone down and they need to fix the bug in the system and get it up and running. So, and then lastly, funding. Again, I'm not talking about an investor. I'm really talking about if one of the founders is investing significantly more money than the other founders. You know, if all the founders, they're each putting in $5,000, then you don't need to include this because that is all clear. Okay, does anyone have any questions? Are these kind of categories clear? Voting buttons? Okay, great. So then, after your founders have identified what are the different contributions that all the founders are going to make to the company, and maybe you've got 4 of these identified, you assign a value to your categories. So I just came up with a fictional company. The founders decided that these 4 categories were captured the contributions that those founders were going to make to the company. And they, as a group, decided that the pre-existing IP on a scale of 0 to 10 was an 8. That was pretty important. The business knowledge is a 5. I personally think business knowledge would be more of a 7, but I don't know. Anyway, but I made it a 5. Commitment and risk was an 8. Connections 4. Domain experience 6. So this part so far has been pretty easy. Easy for the founders to get together, decide what their contributions are, what the relative weight of each contribution to the future of the company would be. But you do need to be prepared to have a candid and open conversation with all the founders to come to this agreement. Is this all clear? Yes? Okay, great. So this is the difficult part. So now you need to go through each founder and decide and determine what each founder contributes on a scale of 0 to 10 to each quality. So it could be that founder number 1, actually for the IP, pre-existing IP, founder number 3 is the one that's his IP. So he gets a 10 for that category. All of the other founders get a 0. But for business knowledge, could be that founder number 1 and founder number 3 are bringing a lot of business experience, a lot of organizational skills, management skills. So they get 7 and business knowledge. 7 and 1. Oh, that's right. Founder number 3 is a 1. So founder number 1 is the one that has the most business knowledge. And the other ones, let me see, founder 2 gets a 4. Founder 3, he just did the IP, he gets a 1. And founder number 4 gets a 4. So I just created this. Founder, I will point out, on connections, the reason founder number 4 was included as a founder, because maybe founder number 4 knows a ton of investors who would be ready, willing, and able to invest significant amount of money once the company's up and running. So that's a pretty valuable thing for a company. This will not be an easy conversation among the founders. What I have recommended to my clients when they need to work through a decision like this, or sometimes work through the agreements between the owners of a business. There are similar decisions that have to be made that can be kind of personal. I recommend everyone, all the founders, take the information, read it separately, come up with their own charts, and then you meet and compare the charts and work out the final result. Does that make sense? Is everyone with me on this? This is all pretty easy, actually. So now you've got the weights. Now you're determining the weighted scores and percentages for the founders. I've recreated what the weight that they gave each category, and then founder number one, of course, and then I put in parentheses what each founder's score was for each category, just so we wouldn't have to keep going back and forth on these slides. And they total up. They've got, with the scores, founder number one is 135, founder two is 148, three is 161, and founders four is 84. And you end up with a percentage at the end. So I just want to emphasize, for the company that you might form, there may be 4 completely different categories. They may be these 4 categories plus 2 others. You probably don't want to have 10 categories, but there's no hard and fast rule that says you can't. You can combine, for some companies, these contributions could be combined in one, but you can see that this is a little different than just having 25% across the board, which is maybe what they would have done if they hadn't gone through this process. The other valuable thing that you get from this process is this also tells you, as a founder group, where you have gaps in experience and knowledge and abilities. So if you don't have, on business knowledge, if everyone is a 0 to 3, that might tell you that that needs to be your first hire, is an executive with a lot of business knowledge. And so, all right, any questions? Yes. You could. That is not how the Founders Pie calculator, so I don't know if that's harder, but I think this might be easier if, when you say, are you talking about the weight? So the weight would have to total up to, say, 10. That is certainly a fine way to do it. My fear would be a group of founders, if they know it has to total 100%, they would get into the competitive nature. Well, I'm just 20%, but you're 23%, and I don't know. I would think about that, and given the personality of the founders, whether that would work better or this would work better. But this calculates out to a percentage. So, I want to talk first. So this is how the equity of the founders can be divided up. We talked earlier about the first employees and first executives. One of the questions that I often get, and again, it's not always done in a methodical process, is how much equity to give your first executive and first employees. So 9 months down the road, you do want to hire someone who's really going to take the company forward and has strong abilities in management, finding resources, getting investors. There's no hard and fast rule for how much equity you offer any of those first employees or first executives. I can tell you the conventional wisdom is about 5 or 10% of the equity should be kind of mentally reserved for your first CEO. And that's a rough guidepost. 2 to 5% for a chief operating officer. And do people know the difference between a CEO and a COO? Yes? No? No. Well, a CEO is the person who really directs the future of the business and of the company, and really has responsibility to oversee everything. Product development, marketing, investing, maybe debt that the company wants to take on. Clearly, they don't handle all of those things on a day-to-day basis, but everyone reports to the CEO. A chief operating officer is just that. That's the person that maybe doesn't make the strategic decisions and doesn't make the corporate finance decisions, doesn't make the investment decisions, but makes sure that the company is operating well. So if the company is manufacturing products, COO will oversee the manufacturing, the sales, distribution, maybe marketing. So they're more hands-on. So often a COO in bigger companies, of course, is promoted to the CEO position. That's not always a career path, but it is often a career path. So getting back to what you can expect to offer these new employees and early employees and early executives, 5 or 10%-ish for a CEO, 2 to 5 for a COO, 1 to 2 for executive vice presidents, and for board members, this usually comes up before the early employees and early executives, and board of advisors, I would recommend not offering them more than 0.5 to 1%. Yeah, executive vice president. So executive vice presidents, in some companies they're just called vice presidents, but if you get bigger, they decide that they have to make the more senior vice presidents, they have to give them their title a little more oomph. So you could have an executive vice president or a VP of marketing. So that person, or a VP of sales. So these are people who have overall responsibility for functional divisions in the company. You might have it's often to have a VP of human resources, although now they're beginning to call them VP of people or VP of people resources, vice president of marketing, vice president of sales, vice president of operations. Those people typically all report to the chief operating officer. Now, for your startup companies, you're not going to have this kind of a structure right away. These are very mature companies. So, but let's say a startup company, go a year and a half, it's hired its first CEO, and the CEO has really been developing the company. There may be a need to have someone who's directly responsible for the marketing. And I cannot emphasize how important it is for a startup company not just to have great technology, so really good existing IP, but if you've got all the best technology in the world, unless you know who your client base or who your market or where your market is, you're never going to get off the ground. So marketing is a really critical role for startup companies. So does that answer your question? Okay. So I want to talk about a couple of other concepts that relate to founders. So if you notice, these categories, except for the pre-existing IP, they all contemplate future contributions. So, the business knowledge, that someone has business knowledge, but you're assigning them their value based upon what you think they're going to do. Same thing with commitment, connections. You're assuming that this founder is going to be making those connections. What happens if founder number 2, after 6 months, decides to move to Albuquerque and be a hot air balloon pilot? I don't know. And this happens a lot. So what you, as founder number 3, would hate is if founder number 2, I should have given them names, founder number 2, Clarence, decides he wants to move to Albuquerque. He leaves. He's got 28% of the equity of this company. And he was supposed to be providing a fair amount of domain expertise, commitment, all of that. And he's left. So how do you, for me, I as a lawyer, I'd want to protect all the founders, but I'd be kind of worried about founder number 3. So there are two ways to help alleviate this problem. So the first way is we can always assign additional equity to the founders 6 months, a year down the road, to the founders who are really stepping up to the plate and are really giving it their all. And of course, when we assign more equity to founders 1, 3, and 4, that's of course going to dilute the ownership of founder number 2. Does everyone understand that, how that dilution, that's voting yes or no? Okay. The second concept, which I would highly recommend, and it's a really important concept for you to know when you're dealing with ownership of any entity, and that's the concept of vesting. So I want everyone to use their voting buttons. Does everyone know what I mean when I say vesting? Yes, no? Okay, kind of, or maybe kind of. All right, so vesting is a process by which an equity grant actually becomes permanent or irreversible in incremental steps based upon the passage of time. It can also be based on performance criteria, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So the best way to describe it is with an example. Clarence starts working for a company on January 1. He's given 100,000 shares of stock, but they vest 25% at the end of each of the next 4 years. So if Clarence they decide, the board of directors, this is a mature company, decides Clarence is not doing his job, and they fire him in mid-July, Clarence walks away, he has 0 stock. He is not vested. On December 31, he vests in 25,000 of his shares. That's 25%. So if Clarence leaves on January 2nd of the next year, he walks away with 25,000 shares. He leaves 75,000 shares with the company. Those shares that are unvested, the term is they are subject to forfeiture. So you forfeit those shares if you leave the company under usually any circumstances. So Clarence, at the end the second year, he gets to keep 50,000, so 50,000 of his shares are vested, and 50,000 are unvested. So that's what I mean by vesting. You can also have equity vest based upon the achievement of milestones, and this is pretty common. You can have someone whose responsibility it is to bring in funding. Their equity could vest upon the closing of the first round of financing that brings in $500,000 to the company. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's go back to these founders 1, 2, 3, and 4. I personally think founder number 3, on day 1, he's contributed his IP to the company. He should be 100% vested. He's given real value on day 1 to the company. The other 3 founders, assuming they haven't also invested a lot of money, their contributions are in the future. So I would recommend that their interests be granted or issued on a vesting schedule. And the vesting schedule, of course, can be different for every different company. It is 4 years is not uncommon. Most startups that I've talked with, they seem more comfortable with a 2-year because they want to make sure that, doing a startup is, it's pretty risky. So they want to make sure that everyone is really incentivized to work as hard as they can, as fast as they can. So I've seen 2 years having equity vest in 4 increments every 6 months. Sounds like a pretty good schedule to me. So that's a way to make sure that when founder number 2, Clarence, leaves, maybe he leaves with just 4% of the equity, but he's not leaving with all 28% of the equity. Does that all make sense? Okay, great. I have one other thing to say, and then we're going to break for if anyone has any final questions. So we talked about Clarence leaving and these 4 founders, early executives. I will say just a minute and a half, there might be another Ignite workshop about what you can expect to give to investors when investors come forth with money. And it is so, that is just so determined by the individual situation. For an early startup, if you have an angel investor who's investing $250,000, the reality of it is you probably can't go forward with your startup without that money. So the tendency is for founders to give up a lot of equity to that early investor. And I would just caution you against giving an early investor anything more than 10 or 15%. I know investors will want 30%, but there are a lot of other ways to get money from an investor: convertible debt, plain debt. We could probably talk all night, and everyone would have had to have brought sleeping bags for us to cover that. All right, but I do want to talk about the agreement among the founders. This is something I spend a lot of time with, not just with startup companies, but with mature companies, is the agreement among the business owners that manage how their shares or membership interests are going to be handled in the event of some big sale event. And that is if one of the founders is hit by a proverbial bus. So if, let's say, all of these founders, they're all vested. Founder number 4, she is hit by the proverbial bus, and she leaves all of her interest to her deadbeat cousin, Clarence. So all of a sudden, let's make it founder number 2, because 28% is a pretty big percentage. So all of a sudden, all the other founders, they have to be doing business with Clarence. And and Clarence may be completely uninterested, but he's got voting power, 28% voting power. So I highly suggest that early on, founders, in addition to going through this calculation, also spend the time to develop it's an owner's agreement. For a corporation, it'll be called a shareholders agreement. For an LLC, you would put these provisions in the company agreement. And that agreement has rights of first refusal. So if a founder dies, becomes disabled, that founder's estate or that founder has to give all of the other founders a right to buy that founder's interest out. And the agreement sets forth how the purchase price is determined. Maybe if one founder has superior rights than the other founders. These agreements are very specifically tailored for the individual company. And I cannot tell you how many clients have come to me when they haven't had that agreement in place, or they've had an old one that didn't really contain all the provisions they should have, and something happens. Maybe one of the founders gets a divorce, and part of his or her equity is assigned to the spouse. So all of a sudden, you've got a lot of extra shareholders or members. So does that all make sense? And does anyone have questions about and again, we could talk about the owner's agreement at length. Yes. You probably wouldn't have provisions for that in what I call the owner's agreement, but what you would probably have is either a stock option agreement or plan, or for an LLC, it would be called something quite different. So the founders, who are probably all members of the board, would adopt a an option plan to give options to early employees. They have a set amount in the pool, and they can give those options or grants of equity to the new hires as they're brought on board. Does that answer your question? I would recommend that. And things change, so as long as the founders are kind of clear that there is going to be a pool, and that pool typically is 10 to 15% of the total equity. So I would recommend that the founders, at the same time they're going through this calculator, have a bigger pie chart that shows how much equity the founders are going to own, how much equity is going to be for this employee, board member, advisor pool, how much equity will be set aside for investors. Now, until there are investors or early employees, the founders, of course, still own 100%. Right? Everyone get that? Okay. Does that answer your question? Kind of? Okay. Well, I'm going to be here afterwards, so if you want to talk a little bit more about it, I'm happy to discuss it more. Yeah. You can do this with an LLC, membership interests. I will say, if you, because this is another thing I deal with a lot, and I've had to change clients who come to me as an LLC, and they're, blowing and going, and they've got 8 members. They've got someone who wants to invest a lot of money and take a 15% interest, but the investor says, I think it's very nice that you're an LLC, but I want to invest in a corporation. So you need to convert to a C Corp. And so stock options, so if you're planning a company that's going to have employees and options, and you're going to have a lot of a lot of owners, I would recommend that you form a corporation. It can be an S corporation for as long as it qualifies as an S corporation, but not just because it's easier to manage this with shares doesn't mean that's the best solution. But sometimes investors tell you that they want to invest in shares in a corporation. Yes? Oh, it's still called stock. It's just not publicly traded. Yep. There's no public market. Well, there's the rub. So all these founders, we'll say that there's shareholders, so one has 260 shares, 280 shares, 30, or so forth. So founder number 2 dies, the other founders have the right to buy her stock from the estate. The company agreement needs to set forth a process by which you determine what the purchase price of those shares would be, because there's no public market. And that is not easy. I work with companies. There's 4 kind of typical methods. The most expensive, which is the most accurate, is to hire a business appraiser. And there are people who make quite a good living, and they evaluate companies and appraise them, and they come up with a value of a company. And they look at the market, your products, what your sales are. Another method is that the founders every January or once a year get together and they decide, and I say founders, maybe the shareholders, get together and decide, for the next year, we're going to agree that the value of the company will be $420,000. So any sale that occurs until we update this little statement, it's going to be based on a total value of $420,000. That is less accurate, but at least everyone has agreed to that. And there's no one. And what you would hate to do is say, we're going to buy your shares and then not have a process by which you determine the purchase price. That can be a big mess and a lawsuit. So in front, you had a question, or is it covered? So, You could do, there are two things. I'll repeat the question. What is the best practice for separating voting power from like ownership interest? Is that correct? So the two things, we are running up against our time deadline, but let me finish this. You could, which is pretty complicated and you'd need a lawyer, but you could issue non-voting common stock or special non-voting preferred stock. So maybe founders 1, 2, and 4 would be issued non-voting preferred stock, so they get the same amount of, so they'd still get 26% or 28% of the dividends and the value of the company if the company were sold. They just don't have any voting rights. And that is a very efficient and clear way of doing that. It is pretty sophisticated and requires, frankly, an investment in your legal budget, So the second way is you can also agree, put in place voting agreements. So founder 1 gives founder 3, they sign a voting agreement. So founder 1 gives founder 3 the right to vote founders 1 shares. You also need someone who knows what they're doing to prepare that, because you have to make sure they're enforceable. It's only good for a certain period of time. It has to be in writing. So those are the two suggestions that I have, and I've done both of them. I think the non-voting common stock is probably the better way to do that. So one more question? Up back there. Yes. Unless you make arrangements ahead of time, it would all still be founders. It would all still be stock. People talk about founder stock. Really, that founder stock is just stock. Now, you could set up in an employee stock option pool that the stock that's available to early hires and all employees is non-voting common, in which case then the difference is because they've set up that difference. So I think we've run out of time, and we're at about 10 till, and I know everyone has classes to go to. I hope this has been helpful and interesting and meaningful, and I'll be up here. Emmanuel, do we have something else? We're good. So thank you very much for being such a great audience. Thank you for using your voting buttons, and I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I'll be here for a little bit longer.